good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for having us again. This is not the first time that we are here. We've been here before. We've been, all of us, all the institutions that are going to present tonight have been at the 2019 Association on American Indian Affairs Repatriation Conference in Phoenix, or close to Phoenix in Arizona. It's 4 institutions presenting tonight from 2 countries, Germany and Switzerland. We are going to start with Mona Suhrbier, representing Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt, followed by Monika Zesnik and Ilja Labischinkski from Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin. We will have a short break after these 2 presentations, and we want you to ask questions or comment. And we also have questions, and we need to sit together and talk about a lot of things. So this is not the start because we started earlier, but we need to continue the discussions that we already started. After that break, we will have the Nordamerika Native Museum from Zurich in Switzerland, represented by Karin Kaufmann. And last but not least, Robin Leipold from the Karl May Museum in Radebeul in Germany again. So without me talking too much, I hand it over to Mona Suhrbier to present the World Cultures Museum in Frankfurt. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for introducing me and our group. First of all, I would like to thank the association, especially the organizers of the conference, Colleen Medicine and Shannon Keller O'Laughlin, and the whole team for the honor to be here. For me, it was extremely important to have already participated, as Martin just explained, in person at the Healing Divide Conference 2019 in Phoenix. There I could get already to know many of people who take part already this year, as well this year, who explained to me the importance of repatriation. The whole atmosphere of this event in Phoenix was more than words can teach. Thank you for this. I would like to give some special thanks in advance to my presentation. Which is about the repatriation of Chief Daniel Holohorn-Beer's shirt to his successor, Chief Duane Holohorn-Beer, in June 2021. In this process, the museum, Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt, was accompanied and helped by many people. I would like to name some. I would like to give my special thanks to the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Mr. Ben Rod in Rosebud, for supporting Chief Duane Holohorn-Beer's request. I would like to thank the manager of the National NAGPRA program at the US Department of the Interior, Melanie O'Brien, and the repatriation manager at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, Jaquetta Swift. They helped a lot with our information about texts and about NAGPRA regulations. Many thanks go to Consul General Patricia Lacina in Frankfurt, the former General Consul, and her Cultural Officer, Press and Culture Department, and here especially to Annie Bünker for supporting the museum. Finally, I would like to thank Chief Duane Holohorn-Beer for his patience with a German institution. I would now like to share my presentation. Can you see it? Like this? Is it there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I said already, it's about the repatriation of a leather shirt. And I would, before I start with this, I would like to introduce in short words the Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt, which is a museum of the city of Frankfurt, a city museum. This is the museum. It's a small former home, a house to live in, which was reconstructed into a museum. And I would like to talk about the history. The museum dates back to 1817, the founding year of the Senckenberg Natural History Society, where the first collections in Frankfurt went to before. Where is it? Do you see my presentation?
No, it's gone.
It stopped. I don't know why. I try to open it again. Sorry. What happened? The museum itself was founded as the Völkermuseum in 1904. It was an independent museum of anthropology and is called today the Weltkulturmuseum. In March 1944, the museum was destroyed by a bomb, and all the written material about collections were destroyed in this war. Only the register cards and the register books, inventory books, they survived. And of course, many objects survived this war because they were put in another place outside of the city of Frankfurt. And in 1970, only in 1970, the museum was reopened at the actual address where we are still now. The collections of the museum are worldwide. In total, it's 65,000 objects from Africa, Oceania, Southeast Asia, and the Americas. 14,000 objects from the Americas, from native people, are mostly from Middle and South America. 1,027 are from Canada and the USA. And the larger parts of this number are from the Canadian Northwest Coast and the Arctic. Another very important focus of our museum is on contemporary and modern non-European art, which is collected from the collecting started in the 1980s. I will come now to my presentation for today, the repatriation of Chief Daniel Holohorn-Bear's leather shirt to his successor, Chief Duane Holohorn-Bear, which took place this year, June 2021. This is the shirt which was repatriated. It is a deerskin leather shirt of the Teton Lakota Sioux of South Dakota, and it was presumably fabricated at the end of the 19th century. I know it from the literature. It was called war shirt or leadership shirt or shirt of honor. And such shirts were worn by decorated chiefs at that time. The shirt is colored in yellow and green, and it wears a bedded pattern as well as a star motif and is decorated with human hair. I don't know if you can see this. Such bedded decorations in red and green are called feather patterns, and they were used to decorate the shirts of the Holohorn-Bear family and their ancestors in rosebud. Thus, what we see here on the in the detail photograph is a family pattern. The star with 5 rays might indicate, among other things, that the shirt was possibly worn in the performance of police work on the reservation. On the basis of a historic photograph. Oh, jetzt ist es. I don't know what happens. Sorry, I did nothing. I come back. Okay, again. On the basis of the historic photograph of Chief Duane Holohorn Hornbier, to whom the shirt was repatriated, he was able to identify in the year 2019 during a visit in the German Leather Museum in Offenbach. He identified the shirt he knew from a photograph in this exhibition where the shirt was on loan from the Weltkulturmuseum. Chief Duane Holohorn-Bier immediately recognized his great-grandfather's shirt. He told me afterwards in a long telephone conversation that he had been looking for this shirt for many years, and he expressed his desire to see it. And so Chief Duane, his wife Elsie, and their grandson came to Frankfurt to visit the shirt in 2019. This was the historic photograph on which Duane could identify the shirt of his great-grandfather, Chief Daniel. Then the photograph was taken on the Rosebud Reservation in 19 by the photographer John Elvin Anderson. There are as well a few later photographs showing Chief Daniel Holohorn-Bier wearing other shirts. But it is this early and frequently published photograph of Chief Daniel Holohorn-Bier from John Elvin Anderson that has become in a way iconic. It turned out to be an image with an outstanding presence in the collective image memory of the Holohorn-Bier family. It turned out to be symbolic for Chief Duane's person and is at the center of his reverence today. The great-grandson's year-long search for the shirt is evidenced by this private photo. Chief Duane Holohorn-Bier is the head of the family today. You see him on the photograph on the right, where he himself is as a young man in front of the historic photograph. Chief Duane succeeds his great-grandfather and also holds his position as a leader of the Sundance. Research on the person of Chief Daniel Holohorn-Bier reveals that he was an important and well-known man. Until his death, he was held in high esteem both within and without his community. Chief Daniel Holohorn-Bier was a shirt wearer, a decorated warrior and leader who was entitled to wear a leather shirt. As a young man, he had fought against US troops. After the reservations were established, he became chief of police in Rosebud and was a highly respected chief. Externally, he acted as a diplomat in negotiations with the US government. He participated in several delegations to Washington, D.C., and advocated for any improvements in the reservations of that time. During Chief Daniel's lifetime at the turn of the 20th century, the Lakota indigenous community suffered greatly from oppressive colonial era conditions. Here we see Chief Daniel Holohorn-Bier during a delegation visit in Washington in 1913. I might come back to this photograph later. My provenance research about the shirt revealed the following. The shirt was acquired in 1908 by the then Völkermuseum in Frankfurt in an exchange with the American Museum of Natural History in New York. This exchange is documented in both museums. The American Museum of Natural History had received the shirt in 1906 as part of a large donation from the New York millionaire, socialist and philanthropist James Graham Phelps Stokes. Under what circumstances the shirt was previously entered the Phelps Stokes collection from the personal possession of Chief Daniel Holohorn Bear cannot be reconstructed anymore. For 113 years, the shirt was then in the possession of the Weltkulturmuseum and was on permanent loan on the German Leather Museum for almost 30 years. I have to see what is the next picture. No. I come back to the picture of the... from my first telephone conversations with Chief Duane, it became clear that there existed two stories of the shirt. The rationale underlying Chief Duane's request for repatriation was passed orally through generations in the Holohorn Bear family. But the family story did not match the inventory data and facts available at the museum regarding the history of the object's acquisition. In our first telephone conversation, Chief Duane Holohorn Bear described the circumstances surrounding the death of Chief Daniel Holohorn Bear, who was participate in delegations of indigenous leaders in Washington, D.C. twice, in 1905 and 1913. On the second visit, where we can see him still here on the photographs, on the big one, he is the third man from left in the back, and on the big photograph, it's himself. On the second visit, he died of pneumonia. His body was taken back to Rosebud, but his personal belongings were missing. And Chief Duane, he was sure that for the visit in Washington, D.C. in 1913, his great-grandfather would have carried with him the shirt he knew from the photograph from the year 1900. That is the shirt in Frankfurt, in the Frankfurt collection. After Chief Daniel's death, this shirt was considered to have been disappeared since then. According to provenance research, however, the shirt depicted in John Elvin Anderson's photograph was already in Frankfurt in the year 1908, years before Chief Daniel's death in 1913. This means that Chief Daniel must have worn another shirt when passing away in Washington, D.C. Exactly which shirt it was cannot be easily determined anymore, because photographs of the delegation in Washington, D.C. show Chief Daniel Holohorn Bear only in street clothes. Chief Duane's request for the return of the shirt, first made orally, was on the basis of his family record. In his written request on March 20, 2021, he changed his rationale and explained the patterns of the shirt as family patterns. The illegitimacy of the acquisition of the shirt could not be proven, but two facts exist. The shirt was without doubt in the chief's personal possession prior to its passage into the Phelps Stokes collection. The entire community in Rosebud suffered the oppressive colonial era conditions that prevailed at that time. The leather shirt continues to represent a cultural Pacific identity-building objects of religious significance to the Teton Lakota indigenous community until the present day. It bears the special patterns that are undoubtedly associated with the Holohorn Bear family. And for Chief Duane Holohan Bear and his family, the return of the shirt was like the return of the great-grandfather himself. Due to COVID-19 travel restrictions, the shirt couldn't be returned personally and couldn't be taken personally. And therefore, it was carefully packed and picked up by a shipping art company on May 28, 2021, to be transported to the Rosebud Reservation in the United States. 2 weeks later, it arrived then in South Dakota. And it was an arrangement which was taken with all people in the process, because Chief Duane wanted it to be back for a ritual which took place in early June this year. And so we couldn't do it differently than just send it back with the shipping company. It arrived well, everything went well. And I just want to thank, at this point, to the Freundeskreis, the friends of the museum who did the finance of this shipping. What was left? What has been left? It has been left a museum's inventory card with a nice drawing and a detailed description of the shirt. And what has left also, what I cannot show now, is because I couldn't load it up, was a 3D photograph of the shirt, which is in the museum now, and we can share with anyone who has interest in this 3D photograph. Finally, I would like to ask the organizers if they could now show, I will stop now and show the film, a short film which shows the visit of Duane in Frankfurt. Thank you.
Iron Shell has the same design on his shirt. It was a family design that his father wore. Ironshot had 2 oldest sons, but when the leadership came down the line, Hornbear received leadership position. So he assumed his father's role as the next in line for hereditary leadership of the Teoshpai, the extended family. But it also placed him in the category of leadership, a position that he held during the time of both civil and wartime period. The star is there, which indicated that he did the Sundance, and maybe perhaps he led a Sundance. So today, I lead a Sundance at home. So I'm here today. I pray to His Spirit for guidance. I know He hears me in the spirit world. Every year when we bring out His sacred pipe. And there is another one, a sacred pipe that had also returned. Because He had many different pipes that He used for many different ceremonies, such as many different shirts that He wore for different occasions of leadership. It's been a hard journey just to come here today. I'm humbled. Not just to see the picture, but to hold in my hand, like I'm holding His hand. I'm holding His hand. And say, Grandpa, come home. Grandpa, come home. We need you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mona. So as you see, things can happen. The return happened earlier this year. It was reported by Indian Country Today, so you can get more information in English there if you're interested in that. We are more than ready for your questions, but we have one more presentation, and then we can go to answer any questions that you already might have. So we're now having Monika Czesnik and Ilja Labischinkski presenting the Ethnographic Museum in Berlin.
Okay, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Mona, for this very impressive film. Me and my colleague Ilja Labischinkski, we will have our presentation together and we'll talk alternately. My name is Monika Czesnik, and I'm the curator for the North American collections in the Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin. There I'm responsible for a collection of between 25,000 and 30,000 objects. Besides, I'm also working for the planning of the exhibitions of the Humboldt Forum, where our museum is in the middle of moving. And I'm also responsible for communication issues in the museum. So for the first part, I would hand over to Ilja. Ilja, the floor is yours, and I'll try to open our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us here on this conference, and thank you to Colleen and Shannon and Martin for inviting us again on this conference. I just realized today that 2 years ago was my first virtual conference, which is kind of strange now because I think it's already the third today, so it has become the new normal. So it's strange to see how things happened. But yeah, my name is Ilja Labischinkski. I've been working for the Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin since 2015. Together with Monika, I worked in the North American department as an assistant curator, and since 2019, I'm provenance researcher at the Zentralarchiv, the Central Archive of the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, the Berlin National Museums, where I am researching the collections from colonial contexts in the Ethnologisches Museum and the Museum for Asian Art. My main focus at the moment is researching the appropriation acquisition contexts of human remains in the collections of the Ethnologisches Museum, but I will get to that later. Now I want to just briefly give you an idea of the structure of our institution, which is, even for a German audience, rather complicated, but I would just try to give you a short idea how we are organized. While Monika is working in the Ethnologisches Museum and I am working in the Zentralarchiv, both of our institutions form part of the Staatliche Museum zu Berlin, the Berlin National Museums, where we are working together in total with 18 museums and 3 research institutes. Like for the museums have a very broad collection from contemporary art, national galleries, archaeological museums, and so on. The Staatliche Museum zu Berlin falls under the umbrella of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, which was founded in 1957 to preserve and continually enrich the cultural artifacts belonging to the former state of Prussia, which after World War II no longer existed. Our foundation was funded by the federal German government, which is, for a German context, rather unusual, as you can see in the context of Frankfurt. Normally, the museums are run by cities or the states, but our institution is run by the federal government, but also by all other 16 German individual states. So these politicians also form the board of our foundation. So the situation is that the collections are legally owned by the Prussian Heritage Foundation, but the board of our foundation is run by politicians who are also responsible to decide the questions of ownership, as for example restitution. The place where I work, the Zentralarchiv, or the Central Archive, is not just the archive of all Berlin National Museums or the memory of these museums, but is also coordinating systematic provenance research for all the collections of the museums. There I work in an interdisciplinary team of 7 permanent provenance researchers, dealing with the complex and diverse contexts and questions such as cultural property seized as a result of Nazi persecution, but also violations of the UNESCO Convention Against Illicit Trafficking of Cultural Property, or, as in my case, questions of objects and collections from colonial contexts. And with this, to present more of the Ethnological Museum, I will give back to Monika.
Yes, thank you, Ilja. I will give you now a short overview about the range of our collections in the museum, and then go over to our exhibition planning for our new venue, the Humboldt Forum. And then we will give you a few examples about cooperations we are having with different indigenous nations and groups, and also referring to the first case of repatriation from the North American collections to the Chugach in Alaska. Our museum, the Ethnologisches Museum, was founded already in 1873. That was quite early. Collecting activities in Europe at these times were frenetic. Anthropologists believed that cultural goods of non-European cultures had to be saved before indigenous nations won't exist anymore. The range of the collections from indigenous cultures living on the national territories of Canada and the US tells about the motivation for collecting, especially in the 19th and the early 20th century, at the time of European colonialism. The majority of the more than 25,000 objects of the North American collections came to Berlin between 1870 and 1914, the beginning of World War I. During this period, most of them were acquired or appropriated from North American collectors and traders or through exchanges with North American museums. The earliest objects stored in Berlin date from James Cook's second expedition and were exchanged in Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island in 1778. Some parts of the collection were brought to Berlin in early 19th century by German explorers like Prince Maximilian zu Wied or Friedrich Köhler, and a collection of, you can see here again, a collection of painted bison robes, hides dates to before 1850. So they're quite old objects too in the collection. The largest single collection with nearly 7,000 objects were brought to Berlin by the Norwegian sailor Johan Adrian Jacobsen, who traveled for more than 2 years the west coast of Canada and Alaska in the 1880s. Parts of these collections will be one issue of our presentation today. As I already mentioned, parts of our museum's current exhibitions are already presented in the Humboldt Forum. You can see it here in the center of Berlin since September this year. Further exhibitions will be opened in summer next year, including the presentations from the Americas. The research resources, storages, archives, and the library, they will stay in the building in the outskirts of Berlin, which also served as our exhibition space for nearly 50 years till 2017. The space where the Humboldt Forum has been reconstructed is the former location of the historical Royal Berlin Palace. The Humboldt Forum is designed to be a multidisciplinary venue and the cause of a lot of controversial debates in the moment in Germany. The ongoing public discussion shows that the interests are very heterogeneous. A noteworthy number of civil initiatives embedded in the post-colonial discourses has a highly critical approach to the reconstruction of a building representing colonial powers as well as to the contents, the anthropological collections. Most of the critiques refer to collections gained under the authority of colonial powers, as from Namibia, Tanzania, or regions in the Pacific like Papua New Guinea or Samoa. Collections from the American continent and especially North American natives of First Nations are, up to now, less part of the public focus, if nothing else, because the far-reaching consequences of colonization and exploitation for indigenous peoples in the Americas is yet not in the focus of the public debate in Germany, but we will see if this changes when we open next year. Sorry. In the Humboldt Forum, the presentations of the North American collections have different aspects and show different perspectives. For instance, the objects from plains cultures will be presented condensed in an open or visible storage area arranged by object types. This allows public access to objects that are otherwise not on view, since most of the items of our museum remain in the storage and are not accessible to the public. The open storage shall serve as a material database to show a wide range of the collection as a resource also for research. Our idea is, and therefore I'm interested also about, or we are interested about your reactions, to get into critical discussion with members of indigenous communities about these collections and entangle different sorts of knowledge. As in many European anthropological museums, the information, especially about older objects from the 18th or 19th century, is often very limited. Therefore, we want to use the open storage concept to disclose transparently the plains collection, and we are open for all resulting consequences. Another presentation or another focus of the exhibition in the Humboldt Forum is on the Northwest Coast cultures, mostly from British Columbia. In this context, we collaborate, for instance, with the Haida Museum on Haida. On this point, I also want to thank the colleagues there, Chugach Collection and Sean Yang and I Hans, who are serving as consultancy curators for our exhibitions. The cooperation takes place on various levels. There are these 2 bowls in the exhibition, for instance, and the bowl on the left comes from the Haida Nation. It was carved by the renowned artist Charles Edenshaw before 1875, and he was commissioned by Chief Stilter in Old Masset on Haida Quai. In fall 1801, Johann Adrian Jacobsen traveled for about 10 days to Haida Quai, to him known by the colonial name of Queen Charlotte Island. He acquired the bowl for $62.50. Which wasn't a lot even in this time. He acquired it after Stilter's death from his brother and had it brought to Berlin. In 1939, at the beginning of World War I, the bowls were also, like Mona mentioned it for Frankfurt, removed to a safe place, to a bunker in Berlin. And at the end of World War II, they were transported by the Soviet army to the day St. Petersburg. In the 1970s, the bowl were given to the German Democratic Republic, to Leipzig, with thousands of other objects from our museum. And after Germany's reunion, the bowls came again to Berlin in 1990, so they have already quite a journey made in their biography. Today, there is still a descendant of the original owner of the bowl, also called Chief Stilter, living on Haida Quai. His name is Frank Collison, and he participated in the installation of the bowl in the Humboldt Forum in May this year. Due to the pandemic, unfortunately, only virtually. Here you can see how the bowl in the box is brought into the building, because it was so big that you can bring it through the staircases. And here, here you can see as they're raised, and there we had this virtual video conference, and the Haida people were witnessing the raise of the bowl. It was quite an effort for our partners from the Haida Quai Museum to find out who is the descendant of the original owner of the bowl. They were researching family trees and tracing historic photos and maps of Old Masset, but also talking to elders who are in charge of the transferred family knowledge. To find out about these entanglements of knowledge is a complex but worthwhile process. Many steps are necessary to bring together and structure different layers of knowledge. For the 2 exhibitions of the Northwest Coast cultures, as I mentioned before, 2 colleagues from Haida Quai Museum are commissioned as consultancy curators. With their support, the work for the exhibition can also be based on the expertise of various members from First Nations and their perspective. That's a picture of Haida Quai Center and Haida Quai Museum. One exhibition in the Humboldt Forum will take Jacobsen's journey as a starting point. His perspective, presented in detail in his travel log, will be critically commended by different First Nation representatives today. For instance, Haida artist Michael Nicol Jagulanas creates an artwork as a counter-narrative to Jacobsen's travel log, juxtaposing the 19th century Western view with today's Indigenous perspective. Jagulanas' work is a contemporary commentary on the intrusion of ambitious European collectors into First Nations cultures in the 19th century. The comments and counter-narratives will present a more complex view of the salvage anthropology at the end of 19th century, which was fueled by the ideology that Indigenous cultures would disappear. This was an era marked by European expansionism and encroachment on Indigenous peoples across the world. Counter-narratives in this exhibition are intended to create a space to reflect on relationships and resilience in the face of extreme challenges. The second exhibition, also dedicated to Northwest Coast cultures, In this exhibition, the poles will be included, and it's an exhibition entitled Of Cedars and People. The exhibition is also developed with the Haida Museum, and it concerns between the relationship between people and environment. Those were the example of red and yellow cedar as key plants or of the rainforest. Objects and installations to cedar will be used to recount the multi-perspective history that these trees share with humans, illustrated by means of stories. Within the cooperation with Haida, we also include topics like loans, residences, forms of representation, and of course, repatriation. Ilja Labischinkski will now give you an insight of another cooperation in the Humboldt Forum with the Omaha and their community college.
Yes, another example of a collaborative project in the context of the Humboldt Forum is the exhibition Against the Current, Francis LaFleche and the Omaha, which is a collaborative exhibition together with the Nebraska Indian Community College, the NICC, and representatives of the Omaha Nation. The exhibition is about the history of a collection from Francis LaFleche, who is today considered the first Native American ethnologist. In 1894, Francis LaFleche was commissioned by the Berlin Museum to gather a collection of about 60 objects of his own culture, the Omaha, which he sent to Berlin 4 years later. The exhibition that will hopefully open next year in Berlin, as Monica just said, will not just deal with the biography of Francis LaFleche and the history of the collection, but also will open a space for Omaha people to tell their own story of their lives and culture and their past and present. It was the first reaction of our project partners when we approached them with the idea to do this exhibition together, that they don't want another white guy to tell their story. So it is our aim to create a space where Omaha people can tell their story and their perspective on the collection, the objects, and the story of Francis LaFleche. Another example of collaboration with indigenous nations in North America is that we already since 2015 are working together with representatives of the Chugach Alaska Corporation. On a collection from South Central Alaska that was brought to Berlin by the Norwegian sailor Adrian Jacobsen, who was already mentioned by Monica earlier. This collection was brought to Berlin, or was gathered by Jacobsen on the northwest coast and Alaska between 1889 and 1883. Jacobsen not just brought the collections to Berlin, objects and human remains, but also wrote quite an extensive travelogue about his journey. And this travelogue is littered with rather clinical accounts of cemetery robbing and mummy stealing in the name of science. He describes several instances where he robbed graves, took human remains into his possession, and shipped them to Berlin. I remember vividly when the first Chugach delegation visited our museum in 2015. I just started working for the museum some month ago. And John Johnson, the vice director of the Chugach Alaska Corporation, read aloud from the travelogue and he read sentences where Jacobsen describes finding the graves of a mother and a child. He described their bodies were disintegrating in a sense, so he just took the mother's skull and dumped out the contents of the cradle. I still remember John asking us the questions, what happened to our ancestors? And this moment was the starting point of a process of a joint research that finally led to the restitution of 9 funerary objects that Jacobsen robbed from graves in the Chugach region in Alaska. In 2018, the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation returned these objects that Jacobsen had stolen from graves to the Chugach Alaska Corporation. The whereabouts of the human remains could not be determined. I will get to that later, but I just wanted to mention that while we repatriated these 9 objects, which you can here see 3 examples on this slide. Another hundreds of objects still remained in the museum, and these objects today are now part of a joint research between our museum and the Chugach Alaska Corporation that Monica will give you a short insight.
Yeah, it was a visit of another group of members of the Chugach in Berlin, 2019. It showed that the joint communication about the objects entails an exchange of stories linked to those objects. But it also creates the need to involve more people who are interested and related to the cultural heritage linked to the objects. To further that shared interest, we are now in a cooperation that develops collaborative models for exhibition making in the digital as well as in the analog space. Furthermore, we strive for cooperation in the framework of digitizing the collection and archives. The working title of the project is Getting Our Stories Back. And we follow a process-related approach. In internal workshops with elders, the Chugach did a survey using objects list from Berlin and the photos of the visits of the groups that had been here before. And these inspired memories to come forward, as a colleague from the Chugach wrote me, triggering reconnection to culture and ancestors after loss. Therefore, we will also digitize the objects step by step for digital repatriation. Within the upcoming weeks, we will start with a series of workshops with focus group of elders from the Chugach, each time having a different group of objects in the focus. They didn't want to prioritize objects because they said they're all having the same importance to them. Our museum is just installing a hybrid workshop room for transcultural cooperation, where we can either meet in person, like here with the group in 2019, but which won't happen before we have really post-pandemic times, or we can work with the original objects on our side using a two-camera system on Zoom. The Harvard Meta Lab is one of the cooperation partners to support us with the implementation of documentation and recording, as well as to develop ways to transfer the outcomes of our workshops in products that the Chugach can use for their community work, and we as a museum can use also as a pilot for our exhibition and education work. So there will be the next steps, and we will see what will come out of it. And we are really lucky that this is no project where we have a certain date where we have to open an exhibition or to have the project done, so that makes working together quite comfortable in a way. And now I hand over more or less the last time to Ilja.
Yeah. As I mentioned, this very tense and emotional moment where John Johnson, which you can see on the left side of this photo, asked about his ancestors in Berlin, was a starting point for both of us to research the whereabouts of the human remains from the Chugach region, which has become a continuous aspect of our collaboration. It also made it very clear the responsibility that today we have as representatives of these institutions to deal with the colonial and often violent heritage of our institutions. I have to say we have only been partly successful with our research. You can see it on the left-hand side that we found the proof that at least 4 mummies from the Prince William Sound arrived in Berlin, but have never been inventorized in the museum. So we don't know what happened to them in Berlin. We could track down at least 2 human remains in the Museum for Natural History in New York, which might sound quite far away from Berlin, which is also due to the complex history of anthropological collections of human remains in Berlin medical and museum collections. I would love, but cannot go too much into detail here. We don't have enough time. But what I would like to do is just to give you an idea of the human remains that are still today in Berlin from North America. I don't want to go into any detail here, but I would just like to seize the opportunity to inform you about the holdings and maybe to get into contact with you and the right persons to discuss what should happen to the human remains, and maybe after the conference we can inform you and people who are interested in the holdings of the Ethnological Museum about these human remains that are still in Berlin. This is also because we had an inquiry of the US Embassy some few months ago, who has also asked German museum institutions about their holdings of human remains in German museums, and we are very interested in see what how this process now goes on with the possible restitution of human remains from the US from German museums. I have to say we are not the only institution in Berlin that takes care of human remains from North America. There are other institutions who have much larger holdings of human remains, also from the US. But we are also very happy to establish contact to other institutions, and for people who are interested in the whereabouts of human remains in German collections, we are very happy to establish contact and help there. Because I think we are very open to discuss the future or the future of human remains, and looking forward to find contact persons also to discuss restitution processes of these human remains. But I think we are looking forward in talking with you maybe after the conference. And with that, I think the last time hand over to Monika.
Yeah, and I just want to add that there's not talking about sensitive objects. It's not only human remains, but it's also objects like there are 2 ayudas from Suhrbier in the collections, or false face masks from Haudenosaunee, or wampum belts. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that's more than 25,000 objects that are stored in our museum. And I have the curatorial responsibility, which, sometimes can be overwhelming, but we are always very open to get into contact about every issue and see further steps will come from there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Monika and Ilja. I think we already have questions. As I said before, I would like to start with questions right now, then we have a break, and then we continue with 2 more presentations. But this is so much information, we should probably start with the question and answers. So, Shannon or Colleen, would you want to take over and lead that discussion?
Yeah, you bet. Can you all
Thank
take a stop the share drive or the share screen?
Yeah, I will. Just a sec. Yeah, okay.
And
Yep.
Colleen, go ahead. I think you were in the process.
Me?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. There is a question in the chat. How may we contact you? I'm not sure who you is. If you want to elaborate, Jessica, which panelists you were hoping to connect with? Maybe she can let us know. And we also had a raised hand. So I'm going to hand that over to Shell. And what will happen is she'll come on stage and be able to just say her question.
CO, I just wanted to thank you for your time today. I do have a question for you. I'm hearing a lot about, collaborating in these virtual efforts that are going on. I was just wondering about, I wasn't hearing a whole lot about ethical curation. I see a lot of our ancestors' belongings in the collections, and I'm wondering, what efforts are being made to kind of allow these communities to have these. And I understand that there were some things that were mentioned in there that have been repatriated, but there's a lot there. And moving forward, I just wanted to put this out there. Working with National Museums Northern Ireland, we're working with Sean Young as well. And one of the first things that we said to him, well, it's not me. I'm just working as a cultural liaison, being Cherokee, and they got in touch with me. But one of the very first things that we've done with each one of our communities is the first question is, how can we ethically curate things for the museum so that as things are being returned to their communities, we will have a long-standing and lasting relationship. So are you guys doing anything there that's more decolonized and beyond just having people come and visit and see their own items in someone else's museum? What else are you guys doing? Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for the question. In our cooperation with Northwest Coast cultures and with an emphasis on Haida Culture, next steps will be that they would like to have objects on loan. That is something that has to be chosen. I also had the conversation with Schultz Collection when we were installing these poles, and she was asked by matriarchs, what are they witnessing if they are participating? And she answered that it's the cooperation between us, but of course they wouldn't relinquish from their right to go for repatriation on their own trip or Haida law. And that is something we would be open to. I will just have something more with the Chugach, and then I would like to say a few words about how the way of repatriation was going in the case of the Chugach. For the cooperation, it is, as we understand in this step, it's important for them that they get access as much as possible to their objects, and the digital repatriation is the first step. The next step could be loans, but it could be also analog material repatriation. That's not something we would withdraw from. As I also mentioned, American collections are also not in the focus of German politics, which is good in a way because we can maybe establish cooperation step by step and not under pressure like the colleagues that are responsible for collections that came from colonial areas of Germany. And when the Chugach asked for repatriation of the funerary objects, it was a way to go. They sent a letter first to our director, and then there was the official technological way to go, which was a little bit more complicated than in Frankfurt, as Ilja mentioned, since we are a federal museum. So US Embassy sent a diplomatic note to German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then they sent it to our institutions, and then we recommended from the curatorial part, we recommended repatriation, and our lawyers were involved, and then the advisory board of our foundation. So to make a long story short, it was 2015 in fall when they had been there the first time, and it was 2018 when they came back, which was also because it was the time when there were the US presidential elections. So that was also due to this, it took a little bit longer. So we are step by step trying to get into contact first, I have to say. Since, well, I'm the curator and Ilja does the provenance research, and that's it. And so that's also why we would be happy if people would approach us and also say, please let us know what is in your collections. We had the request from the Stolo Nation in Canada, so we sent them everything we are having on sensitive objects from their nation. So maybe you could also, from your part, tell us what you would wish from a museum like us.
Anyone else want to answer that question? Thank you, Monica. Okay. We have other questions in the chat. Here's a good one. This question comes from Lisa. So were the scalps returned to the prospective nations from the Karl May Museum? Well, this is interesting because the panel that's coming up next this afternoon is about repatriation of one of the partial human remains from the Karl May Museum. But I'd like to turn it over to Robin if you have anything to add.
Yeah, hello. I would say I would give many information, and also about the handover of the one scalp to the Sault Ste. Marie tribe. Back in the panel now, and then in the next panel.
Maybe we can take it a little later, that question, since the Karl May Museum is presenting right after the break.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Yes.
So we come back to that question. We're not forgetting about the question, we're coming back.
Here's a comment, not necessarily a question, also from Lisa. And Lisa, I encourage you to raise your hand and come on stage and elaborate, what institution has these things, and if you have made formal repatriation claims or anything like that. And while we're waiting for Lisa, if she does want to share on stage, there are other questions. So this question comes from Donna. There have been references on and off all week about digital repatriations. I would like to have some assurance that the museums keep the digital versions and the items themselves go back to where they belong.
Yeah, that is could be a logical consequence, I think. And referring to Lisa's remark on the Ordinacini masks, maybe you could get into contact with me directly. Shannon and Colleen, they have the contact dates, and maybe that would be also an example how we could go further on with interest in repatriation of the masks.
Thank you. Also, to follow up on the question that we just presented, I'm going to pull it back up. I also think there are definitely tribal nations that would not want the museum to retain even digital copies. And I just want to point that out. That's also part of the conversation. Okay. Yeah, okay. So Donna, you beat me to it. She also said, of course, tribal permission is asked before making digital versions of items to be repatriated. Of course.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe I can just say for the case of the Chugach Collection Corporation, it was asked before, and was even their idea for us to keep photos of it. So that was asked, and also what remained in the museum was of photographs and information was discussed.
Yeah, I also just received yesterday from a colleague from the Chugach, from Andrea Flörsheimer, the Chugach policy for cultural sensitive material and their digitization. That is very helpful for us too. It's also something we are striving for. We have a new colleague who is curator for transcultural cooperations, and she's working now on a project of decolonizing the digital infrastructure, because the databases we are having, not only that there is sometimes very poor information and wrong ones, it's only in German, and so there are so many things that have to be done for talking about decolonization. And I think our museum does it now more and more in the last 10 years, step by step. And we really hope that this will go on.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. This question is also from Shell. I would still like to know about future ethical curation in the future to obtain cultural items with consent as we move forward. How is this being addressed?
I think it's a very complex question. And what we do now, I can say it for all colleagues in the museum, but at least for us, that we wouldn't develop exhibitions anymore without experts from the indigenous nations where they come from. But I have to say that was not the case when I started a couple of years ago, not at all.
Yeah, I would like to say the same. We try to organize exhibitions together with indigenous or First Nation partners, which is not always easy, because you need to get the right contacts to the right people, which are for the Frankfurt Museum all over the world. I'm not only responsible for North America, but also for South America. And so there are many partners, and we always have to, in a way, focus on one project with a certain amount of partners. So we try our best. Sometimes we made already a film. We produced a film with partners from Canada, from the Northwest Coast, which were commenting on objects in the collection. And this was a project realized only with First Nation partners, also a filmmaker and so on, and exhibitions as well. What we also do is not only with to work with indigenous curators, but with indigenous artists. We think that this is also a very good possibility over the long distances we have to work, and we have to develop things in a certain amount of time. We try to work a lot with artists.
Thank you, Mona. Sorry, go ahead. I just, since this was Shell's question, she has her hand raised. Like, I just want to make sure that if she has a comment to add to her own question, that she has a moment to ask it. But okay, so I'll bring her on. If Shell, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yes. And can you hear me? Oh, I see me. Okay. All right. I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge you guys are working in the system and you are learning this as we go along. I wanted to take a moment for everybody to just kind of like breathe for a second. We're all learning. And I also wanted to just invite you guys. I think it would be really helpful if maybe we met with the team at some point at National Museums Northern Ireland with our whole Indigenous team that we have. Just so you know, we also work. This isn't just a Turtle Island thing. Like, we are also working on Indigenous ancestor repatriation from Peru, the Solomon Islands. I mean, like, we have people even here for this NAGPRA conference that are coming from all over the world as well. So I would like to encourage you maybe to meet with us so that you can see how we do some things and maybe some of the terminology that we use as well, instead of, responding specifically to things, just talking about maybe, Indigenous ancestors being as the humans that they are and remain. So I would just like to offer that to you, and I will put my email in the chat if that's okay. Wado.
That would be great.
Thank you, Shell. And
you.
Martin, I know you wanted to share.
Yeah, just very briefly, because last time when I was here at the conference in 2019, I presented, because I was back then curator for collections from North America and the Arctic at the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden. I changed my position. I'm now working in a small museum in Switzerland and exclusively with contemporary art and with the artists. So what I'm saying now is not meant to be an excuse, but just to explain the situation that I have been in when I was the curator for these collections. Because being curator is not the same at every museum. That is the first thing. And then when it comes to ethical questions, we need to learn. There's no question there. But there's also a problem for some of us in these different institutions that even if we are the curators, that doesn't mean that we have any power of anything else that outside our own small responsibility. So in Sweden, for example, there is the National Museums of World Culture do have an online database that you can search through online. Ethical responsibility for me includes to make everything accessible for you. And in Sweden, Swedish is spoken. So first thing that I did is I tried to translate everything into English. I mean, my English, but what we tried to do is make especially the important data for when it comes to ancestors, all that needed to be translated into English, but in a way that is not offensive for tribes, still makes the information necessary available. But apart from that, working with the online database and only translating and adding data, I was not able to do anything. I could not really block images that are already in the database. I was not allowed to take objects of the exhibition that were already part of the permanent exhibition that existed for more than 10 years. So my limitations were a problem for me, and that is a problem that probably all of my colleagues here in Europe have. So we need your help, and we need you to approach the museums and let the museums know what we are doing wrong. When it comes to information on the collection, I mean, you need access to these data. But there are different ways. So some of my colleagues that present here do have online databases available, not necessarily the whole collections available online, but again, to certain extents. And there might be sensitive material in these databases with images that should not be there. That is something that we need to hear from you. So again, it's longer than I wanted to talk, but this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, well, there are no more questions in the Q&A right now, and so I wonder if this makes sense for us to take a short break. We're about halfway through now.
Yep, sounds good. And then we have a lot of time afterwards also to continue a discussion or properly start a discussion with you, not only answering questions.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, like 15 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that?
Yep. 10, 15, what do you prefer?
I think we have to go for a 15-minute break.
15-minute break?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, and for those of you in the audience, I'm going to move to the lounge section. If anyone wants to decompress this conversation, I'll be over there. Thank you.
How's that, Colleen, how's that for us? If we leave the presentation, can we enter the lounge now? Because if not, that's important for the participants, the others to know. So
I think so.
We are not hiding.
No, you cannot leave. Sorry,
Yeah.
We have to keep this open.
Yeah.
So everyone,
we can pause it.
Let's take a break. We're going to pause the session, but I don't know that the host can leave. If you're able to leave and come back into the session, if you want to join the lounge and come back, that's fine. But this is going to hold open, and we'll be back at 12:45.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. As we wait for people to come back into the room with us, I thought I would share a little bit of context. First off, I think it is so wonderful that we're able to participate and have discussions with our friends from these international institutions. I want to make sure everyone is aware that the folks representing these institutions may have limited power of what they can do in their institutions. They may also face other issues with the country's laws where these institutions are at. For example, in France, there are state museums, country museums, much like the Smithsonian museums here in the United States, where the items that are in those institutions are considered that country's national patrimony. And it takes an act of their legislature to deaccession those items from collections. So issues of international repatriation are very difficult. And the first step is to build relationships with the people who want to help us with this work. And that is who we have here in the room with us, are those people from these institutions that want to do better, that want to build ethical, decolonized practices in their institutions, and they're asking for our help. So I hope everyone can forgive and give the benefit of the doubt for all the individuals who are presenters today in this session. We do have language barriers. They may also not realize some of the sensitivities with language and other things. And that's part of building the relationship is that we learn we can learn more, and we can act more ethically and more responsibly as we go. So with that, I'm going to shut up and turn it back over to Martin so we can get started and continue these wonderful, productive discussions. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. So this is the second round, and we have two more presentations. The first one is by the North American Native Museum here in Switzerland, where I'm also based. Not at that museum, but in Switzerland. And that is Karin Kaufmann presenting.
Thank you, Martin, for introducing me. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this panel, and especially thanks to the organizers, Shannon, Colleen, and Martin, and to the organization or organizers of the whole conference. We think it's a really important panel to happen, and we are happy to be part of that. I apologize for the weird angle. I'm kind of trying to manage two screens. I'm going to share my presentation now. Okay. So my name is Karin Kaufmann. I work as a research associate at the NONAM, North American Native Museum in Zurich since 2019 only. And I'm going to present shortly our museum. The NONAM is based in Zurich, Switzerland, and is actually exclusively dedicated to arts and culture of Indigenous North America. On the photo, you can see our courtyard of the museum. The whole museum building is located kind of on the outskirts of the city center, and it's not widely known, not even by citizens of Zurich. You can see murals by Ken Anderson, Tlingit artist Ken Anderson, and also in the background, very small, a totem pole by master carver Nathan Jackson. From an administrative and legal viewpoint, the museum and the whole collection belongs to the city of Zurich, more precisely to the School and Sports Department. This is due to the collection history, on which I will briefly touch upon later. Therefore, we have to offer or are offering many education programs and guided tours for local school visits. And yeah, those have been among the main foci of the museum until recently. Currently, I will say a few words about our employment situation. We are a rather small museum. We have like 550% available, like positions available for jobs, and those are shared or have to shared among 10 employees, which all work part-time from between 20 to 80%. Only like 1 to 2 employees are currently involved in collection management and research. And yeah, maybe only one person is currently doing repatriation or is in charge of repatriation issues. We have a permanent collection in the museum. We're organizing special exhibitions. Our next special exhibition will be on treaty making. We will work together with few Indigenous artists. It will be like a collaborative exhibition. We do have also or try to establish a so-called art space in the museum, which is a space which should be dedicated for Indigenous artists in residence only. We also have a soundscape in the museum, which is a room that allows an immersive sound experience, which was produced in cooperation with Indigenous communities from the Arctic and Northwest coast. So that's what the exhibition room looks like, or the exhibition spaces. I will now turn to our collection and say a few words about our collection. Approximately, we have 4,000. It's a very technical term. I already apologize for that. It's inventory positions that equals about 3,700 artifacts in our database registered so far. Since January, we are using a new online version of Museum Plus of the database. The numbers I put here on the slide show the collection, how the collection is kind of composed by region. Those are just the numbers the database kind of sped out. These are not set in stone, and as we are still in the process of reviewing the whole data in order to make the database more searchable and entering data into the database. Yeah, those are just like numbers. The documentation situation of the collection is rather patchy as well, and we kind of lack a lot of information, amongst others, of course, like cultural attribution, let alone provenances. Maybe just a few words on the regional, or on the how the collection is composed. We have like the objects from plains, northeast, subarctic, Arctic, northwest, southwest. Luckily, contemporary Indigenous art, we were able to acquire a collection of Indigenous works from Indigenous artists for a major exhibition, which took place, like it was called Native Art Now. It took place in 2010, and there we have so far around 100 pieces. Rezeptionssammlung, for a lack of an appropriate term, it's like the collection of depictions of Indigenous peoples in, let's say, pop culture in Switzerland, or in European pop culture. I will now talk briefly about the collection history. So the collection was started by Gottfried Hotz, which you can see the guy in the picture. He was a primary school teacher from Zurich, and he was kind of fascinated by Indigenous culture, but was also driven by a certain collection frenzy, which took place at that time. Monika Zesnik was already mentioned. The attempt for saving artifacts because they were afraid that the cultures will disappear. So he collected around 1,200 artifacts between the years of 1920 to 1976. He mostly acquired them from museums, art dealers, collectors, networks, mainly from Switzerland and neighboring countries, Germany, France, and the UK. He also acquired some objects from circus show groups, which like Indigenous artists were participating in those show groups in Zurich, for example, and they also from these Indigenous individuals, he acquired artifacts. He also undertook 2 privately financed collecting trips to the USA and to Canada, which is today known as USA and Canada, in 1963 and 1968, together with his wife, and he acquired further items from Indigenous artists directly. He kind of drew from Indigenous reservations to reservations. He also bought artifacts from trading posts and pawn shops. In 1961, he sold the whole collection to the city of Zurich, to the school and sports department. And in 1963, the museum opened to the public as Indian Museum of the city of Zurich. In 2003, there were 2 more successor in the position of director of the museum. And in 2003, the director at that time was able to rename the museum to NONAM, North American Native Museum. And also the collection focus, she shifted the collection focus to contemporary Indigenous art. We called this slide Steps to Decolonize the Collection. Those are actually our first steps. We're taking first baby steps, let's say, compared to maybe other institutions. We would just share like our viewpoint, our stance on this. Like, as an institution, we are committed to respectful treatment of the cultural heritage of the Indigenous peoples of North America, and we want to make the collection more accessible and transparent to Indigenous communities, especially. And in terms of repatriation, we want to be proactive in reaching out to the communities, and we are always open to dialogue and especially eager to listen and learn. So what we also did is we applied for funding for provenance research financed by Swiss Federal Office of Culture, which we were actually lucky to get. That allows us to conduct some more research on the early collection of Gottfried Hotz, the Hotz collection, and also to kind of making the collection better searchable, which is of great help to us when we receive, for example, queries from communities and researchers. We were also in that process where we can also take a look at the available documentation, inventory cards and correspondences in order to figure out with whom to get in touch with, and probably also to get some kind of to find names or traces of former owners of these artifacts. In that process, we are also trying to digitize the collection by e-museum, like digitizing the collection and documentation. Our main goal with this online collection, again, is to make it better accessible for communities. We plan to go live soon, although it's far from perfect, and we would like to spread the words among our networks that would be available. But again, we are very eager to learn what we have to keep in mind. We briefly touched on this already regarding showing pictures or the use of certain derogatory terms and language use in general. Okay, I will now present 3 cases for repatriation. We haven't had, unfortunately, no repatriation so far. The process, they were just taken up again, like for in the last 1 or 2 years, let's say. So I will start with the most troubling one. It's human. It's a human skull of a skull of a human being, an Arikara individual, and Arikara ancestor. And together with that, it was taken from together with 40 fragments and of tools and utensils from a gravesite. It was collected by Gottfried Hotz when he was on his trip in 1968 in South Dakota. He, yeah, it's hard to say, but he bought it from a dealer apparently in, in human remains near Mobridge. We do, according to archaeological reports, the finds, well, the ancestor is coming from an Arikara village and burial site, which was inhabited around 1800s. It's a based area of what is now Lake Ojai, I hope I pronounced right, in South Dakota. You probably know the story better than I do. So the area was flooded for a dam and hydroelectric project in the early 1960s. When I came across of this story, it was I didn't believe that is possible to flood such a huge area, and those sites were targeted by collectors from the late 19th century, apparently into the 1970s, when the federal collection laws started to be more consistently enforced. And we reached out to the in 2019 to the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and it was our information was received. We did not manage to keep in touch with the people, which is we're kind of unsure how to proceed with this case. A few months ago, we also contacted the South Dakota State Historical Society, which could give more information regarding possible locations of the excavation site. But here we would actually be it would be of immense help from you, from the community, to know what would be the next appropriate step, since we haven't heard back so far. The next case is it's 2 ghost dance shirts from Lakota, Dakota communities, which also those 2 shirts were acquired in 1939 from also by the same collector, by Gottfried Hotz, from a German-American collector and illustrator named Frederick Weigold. Frederick Weigold, he also collected and conducted field work in 1909 on the Lakota Sioux reservations, Pine Ridge and Rosebud, and where he also collected artifacts for the Museum of Ethnography in Hamburg. So far it is not known to us where and under what circumstances he came to these sacred shirts, which are now in Switzerland. We were very lucky to be in contact with members of the tribe and who have ties and relationships to spiritual spokesperson and also to experts in material culture as well. We had a brief Zoom exchange recently because, of course, we needed some assistance in determining whether these sacred shirts could be ghost dance shirts. It was not in our ability to do so, and we were very lucky to have these contacts, and we keep on working. So actually those two cases I just presented, we actually resumed dialogue and action of these cases in the last 2 years, but both were first taken up in the early 2000s. At that time, it just seemed that there was no legal background for continuing repatriation. There was the first actually legal basis for repatriation at that time in Switzerland was to be established only in 2005. So apparently I wasn't there I wasn't working at the museum, but kind of people seem to be hesitant in going further. So the third case I would like to briefly talk about is a sacred otter medicine bag of the Menominee tribe from Wisconsin, used in Medieval in the Great Medicine Society. It was also acquired again by Hotz and also from the same collector as two sacred shirts from Frederick Weigelt before 1939. And we were actually, while reviewing the index cards, we managed to find out the name of the person to whom the medicine bag probably belonged. And the information was written on another index card of another small pouch, also from the Menominee and also from the same collection from Weigelt. And apparently there was a note in the little pouch. I do have a picture here that shows the left side. You can see the inventory cards, and on the right side is the pouch in which this information was. There was a note in the little pouch which gave the name of the person, and it was a very lucky find for us. So we were able to reach out to the Tribal Historic Preservation Office and that check back with the family. We are currently checking and consulting with our legal department of the city of Zurich how a repatriation to the family could be carried out, and hopefully will be carried out. So I just want to mention that we are aware that there are possibly many more artifacts in the collection which are sacred and meaningful and needed by the communities. And in order to identify them, we are kind of dependent on the expertise and knowledge from the communities and also on the outreach. We would like to emphasize once more that we are open to dialogue and repatriation, and we also hope that we can establish and build new relationships through that. But unfortunately, of course, also we are restricted and confined by our administration, and that's always a thing to consider. So until some of these of the artifacts and ancestors will be able to return home, we can only give them a shelter here and try our best to treat them with all due respect and take good care of them. So that's it from the cases I can present. We do have some questions we would like to ask, and I just can quickly go through it, or we can save them later for the discussion round. I would just read them so that we can think about it. So what would be interesting for us would be, how is the best way to make the collection better accessible and transparent? Since we are working on this online collection, is this the way to go, and what has to be considered, and where should we be like careful? Also, we also wondered with whom to get in touch with first. Is it always the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, or are there sometimes museums, cultural centers? Yeah, we're sometimes in need of a contact, as we heard from the other participants as well, and also how to proceed if there is no answer. I don't know whether that's an answerable question, but yeah.
We'd be happy, Karen, to see if anyone wants to come join and kind of have a discussion with you about these questions. While we're waiting to see if anyone would like to join in that discussion, I can tell you that we'd be happy to help you as the Association on American Indian Affairs on all of those questions. And oftentimes it's difficult from where you're coming from in other countries to know quite how to reach out to the diverse Native nations here in the United States. There's 574 federally recognized Native nations in the US, and about 300 other state recognized or other tribal entities and bands. So it can be confusing. There are several places that you can go. The Association on American Indian Affairs is happy to help. There has been to make sure that you're reaching out to the right people if you're not getting responses.
Mm-hmm.
We have contacts with all the TIPOs and NAGPRA consultants, and we also have a large network of folks involved in repatriation, so we can hunt folks down if need be. And who do you get in contact with first? Generally, the protocol is that you always go to the tribal government first with the requests. But what is helpful is if you also copy that kind of correspondence with, CC, the TIPO, the cultural centers, the museums, those other divisions in tribal government.
Okay.
In that correspondence. And, how can you make the collection better accessible and transparent? And again, I think what people have tried to develop in the past is a closed system that's protected, that tribes could speak with you and utilize. We do know there are many institutions that have their entire collections available for public consumption, which can cause concern for tribes on sensitive objects, which you mentioned. So it's nice to have some kind of password protected information or data system with that information. And how to proceed if there is no answer, the association is happy to support that kind of request. I want to make sure everyone's aware of the Restoring Ancestral Connections website. That's a project that was started with our friends from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where they were working to build relationships between international museums and Native American nations here in the United States. They graciously gifted that website and that work to the Association on American Indian Affairs. So you'll be hearing more about that effort to help build these bridges between international museums and tribal nations. We're also working to develop coalitions of tribes who are affiliated with collections in particular museums. So that way we can work together as a coalition instead of as a one-off, doing everything, recreating the wheel each time, and just obtaining items one at a time. And so we feel like if we can build coalitions that are connected with items in particular museums and do it as a group effort, we're going to have more success. We're going to be able to tell more successful stories that are going to build better protocols for all international museums. So I think, and raise the profile of these issues and get good positive attention from the repatriation work. So I'm looking at our chat to see if, and please, we'll save this chat for our speakers, so you can get all this wonderful information of people sharing their contact information and other questions. And we hope everyone will reach out to the speakers through direct messaging here and get everyone's email address. So I'm going to shut up and Karen, go back to you or Martin to continue.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for elaborating and giving so many useful answers already. I probably will need to come back to you in order, like for the real, for each case. So I would just thank you for your attention, and please contact us if you have any queries, questions, or suggestions. We're happy to get in touch with you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karin. And thanks, Shannon, for the explanation. One thing that you have to deal with is that most museums have kind of not only when it comes to stuff, a different situation, but they also, some of them are mixed and have historical objects and an ethnographic collection. Some are specialized, some have only Native American artifacts, and some have a bigger ethnographic collection that is worldwide. So if you want to know more about certain, well, not the museums, but the holdings in the museum in certain countries, then one way is to go, for example, through the museum associations that you find in these respective countries here in Europe. Switzerland, for example, does have a museum association, and that museum association published 2 volumes on the ethnographic collections that you can find in various museums here in Switzerland, throughout Switzerland, no matter what kind of museum it is. So you find different information on collections, not only at the museum, but also with the museum foundations in these different countries here in Europe. Again, there might be a language barrier, but you have a number of people here. Contact us if you need help with language. Just get in touch with us and we can see what we can do for you. But Now we come to the last speaker that we have in our panel, and that is Robin Leipold from the Karl May Museum in Radebeul. So Robin, the floor is yours.
So, hello again. First of all, I will thank the organizers of the conference and also thanks especially Colin Madison and also Martin Schultz for the invitation to this conference and to this panel. So I need a little time. So, okay. So my name is Robin Leipold. I'm the scientific director at the Karl May Museum in Radebeul, small town near Dresden in Germany. So here on the map, you can see the location of Radebeul in the east of Germany. Yeah. I've been working in the museum since 2014, and before I have a master's degree in cultural studies. Today, I would like to provide you with some insights into our case for the return of a human remain from our collection in this year, and as well as provide background on our institution history and also our structure. In 2014, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians approached our museum with a request to repatriate a historic scalp trophy. The scalp had been in Radebeul since 1926. It was acquired by circus performer and collector Patty Frank, who sold his entire collection of ethnographica to Clara May in 1926. So Clara May was the widow of the famous German writer Karl May. And Clara May became especially famous. Karl May became especially famous for his adventure novels here in Germany, mostly set in the Arabian region and in North America. To this day, Karl May is considered one of the best-selling German authors in the world, with a circulation of 200 million books and translation in 100 languages. After Karl May's death in 1912, his widow thought about opening a museum in honor of her husband. It was to present the art and cultural artifacts of the Native American cultures to which Karl May wanted to create a memorial with his novels. For this purpose, Clara May acquired the collection of the artist Patty Frank and finally opened the Karl May Museum in 1928. Patty Frank was appointed administrator of the museum and remained until his death in 1959. A newly erected building in the garden of Karl May's villa in Radebeul served as the location, which was clad on the outside in the style of an American log cabin and named Villa Bärenfett, a name from one of her husband's novels. So here you can see our two buildings in our museum, the Villa Bärenfett and then also the Villa Shatterhand, the former home of Karl May. From the beginning, the Karl May Museum also maintained contact with indigenous people who were actors in Wild West shows in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. In contrast to the state-run ethnological museums, the Karl May Museum was intended to be a place where the history of the Indian people, their decimation and oppression was discussed, and the positive view of the Indian cultures in the sense of Karl May was in the foreground. For this reason, experts have been talking about Indian enthusiasm here in Germany for some years now. This is a phenomenon that had its origins in the time of Karl May and in his stories at the end of the 19th century. Unlike other adventure writers, Karl May longed to meet indigenous people and even dreamed of becoming a friend and brother of an Indian. In his novels, he gave free rein to his dream and created the Blood Brothers, Winnetou and Old Shatterhand. This is one picture from our current exhibition in the Villa Bärenfett. So now you can see the superheroes in Germany. In Karl May's novels, the Indians were the heroes. They were noble and good and always had to defend themselves against corrupt whites. Karl May came from a very poor background. lost his job at a young age, and survived for a while as a criminal, which landed him in prison for several times. He never had money to travel or to immigrate to North America and make his dreams come true. He traveled in his books, taking millions of German children and teenagers with him. Inspired by his stories, children in this country here in Germany constantly blamed Indians and Indians and cowboys instead of cowboys and Indians. The Indians were always the good guys here, the heroes. And some of these young, enthusiastic Indian fans even founded their own clubs in which they wanted to become more involved with the Indian cultures. One of the oldest of these hobby clubs in East Germany even maintained for many decades the grave of Lakota Edward Tutu, who died in 1914 while participating in a Wild West show of the Sarasani Circus in Germany, and wanted to be buried at his own request in the Catholic cemetery in Dresden. To this day, 2 indigenous burial sites of former indigenous participants of Wild West shows exist here in Germany, in Dresden and in Bremen. The descendants are informed about the existence of the graves. To this day, the graves are maintained through donations collected by German hobbyist clubs. In 2014, the 100th anniversary of Edward Tutu's death, a commemoration was held at the Catholic cemetery, and the program was discussed in advance with Tutu's family. The Catholic priest who led the memorial service here delivered his address partly in the Lakota language. So this is the gravesite of Edward Tutu here at the new Catholic cemetery in Dresden. And this is from the commemoration in 2014. The exchange and contact with indigenous people or groups has always been a special concern of the responsibles at the Karl May Museum. However, this was no longer possible for many decades after the Second World War. In 1944, Clara May died. In her will, she stipulated that the entire museum with the complete collection be transferred to the private so-called Karl May Foundation. This foundation was established in 1913 as the last testamentary will of Karl May, who had no descendants of his own. And after the end of the Second World War, there was no more interest in Karl May and in his work here in the East German state, the German Democratic Republic, GDR. The museum had to be renamed, and an administrator was appointed by the Socialist Party leadership after the death of Patty Frank. The usual museum work, scientific processing, research, or networking did not take place here for many decades after that. It was again the hobbyist clubs in the GDR that became increasingly interested in the political problems of the indigenous nations in the United States and in Canada. They organized benefits and fundraisers in support of the American Indian movement or the release of Leonard Peltier. These groups also succeeded again in inviting Indian representatives to the GDR and to visit the Karl May Museum with them. The museum was always very open for these contacts and respected the wishes of the indigenous representatives. Also, it was possible for the indigenous representatives to hold prayers in the museum at any time. Also, a sweat lodge ceremony was held in the museum. Nevertheless, the museum remained a magnet for visitors during this time in the GDR. After the renaming, it got the official name here, Indian Museum. It was the only museum of its kind in the GDR, as well as in the entire Eastern Bloc. It was also one of the most visited museums here in the GDR, with up to 400,000 visitors per year. To this day, our museum is often still known in the Dresden region as the Indian Museum and has been a focal point for generations of visitors who, with an interest in the history and culture of the North American Indians. After the political change in Germany in 1989, the structures and focuses in the Karl May Museum changed again. The Karl May Foundation was able to act independently again and took over the sponsorship of the Karl May Museum. To this day, the museum belonged to this foundation, to the Karl Foundation, and is one of the few private museums in Germany that has to finance itself to 70%. In 1995, Karl May's private belongings returned to the museum after more than 30 years, including his furniture and his historical library. Since then, in addition to the ethnological collection in the Villa Bernfeld, the museum has had to manage the literary heritage of the writer as a further focus and opened another area in the former home of Karl May, his Villa Shetterhand, focusing on the life, work, and impact of the writer. So here for you an impression of the Karl May's historical library now in the Villa Shetterhand. With the expansion of the museum in 1995 to include Karl May's private collection, we now have a total of about 20,000 collection items. Of these, as a literary museum, more than 8,000 are books. Of the 20,000 objects, only 4,000 are ethnographic objects in our museum, including about 1,800 objects from North America, most of which were collected during the time of Patty Frank and Clara May until 1945. The remaining objects came from the Arab world, South America, Asia, and also Oceania. So all this was a rather long introduction of the actual topic, the return of the human remain of the scalp, but which nevertheless seemed to me important for a better understanding of the difficulties and problems in the case of this return. When the Sault Ste. Marie tribe requested to repatriate the scalp, reached the museum in 2014, it was a learning process for the museum staff at this time here. Until then, historical scalp trophies had been exhibited in the museum in order to address the historical context of the war culture in North America on the one hand, and on the other hand, to illustrate the brutality of the European colonial powers against actions against the indigenous population. Today, scalps are no longer displayed in the museum. The request from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians generated awareness among the entire staff in our museum and a debate about the handling of human remains in our museum. Nevertheless, the request for the return of one of these scalps meant a difficult decision for the museum and ultimately the responsible persons in the Karl May Foundation as the owner of the museum. The reclaimed scalp represents an important aspect of our museum's history. It came from Patty Frank's original collection, which he assembled before selling it to Clara May in 1926. But there is no information about the provenience of most of the pieces in Patty Frank's original collection. All we know is that Patty Frank corresponded both and traded with various museums, dealers, and collectors in Germany, England, and the USA. We have, and also in other states of Europe, like Switzerland. We have only very few information of the most pieces of Patty Frank collection. The scalp is one of the few objects of Patty Frank about which he published an origin story. According to this story, it was his first collected scalp trophy. He made a decision to collect scalps when he saw Buffalo Bill Cody and Buffalo Bill's Wild West show with his captured scalp of Cheyenne yellow hair. According to Patty Frank's story, he had bought his first scalp from a Dakota named Swift Hawk for $100 and 3 bottles of alcohol during a 1904 engagement in the United States. This scalp seemed so important to Patty Frank that it even became the museum's official logo in the 1930s. Patty Frank was considered a great storyteller who never really told where he got his collected objects. So whether this story is true or not cannot be determined. The Sault Ste. Mary's tribe's reclamation was ultimately based primarily on a statement in a caption to the scalp, which had already been pictured in a publication in the 1920s. There, a piece of information was noted that is not found in the published history of Patty Frank. Thus, the Dakota Swift Hawk had captured the scalp from an Ojibwe. In the museum's inventory, however, the scalp was inventoried with the affiliation Dakota. So here you can see the historical inventory card of the item. In the museum, there was the desire to invite representatives of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe to a direct conversation. This could only be realized with the support of the city of Radebeul, because the museum and the foundation lacked their own financial resources for this. Representatives of the tribe, the foundation, and the city met on the occasion of the Karl May Festival 2014, which is organized annually by the city of Radebeul and to which indigenous representatives are regularly invited. The result of these first discussions, in which Cecil Paflat and also Colleen Madison participated on the part of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe, was a letter of understanding to establish a joint research plan to clarify the origin of the scalp. So this is the picture from the signing of the letter of understanding in 2014 with Cecil Paflat from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe and our former director in the museum, Claudia Kaulfuß. Collaborative research included object analysis on the age, style, and regional origin of the scalp, archival research on the background of Patty Frank's narrative, as well as information from Ojibwe oral history and also oral tradition. And third, a biographical research on the person Swift Hawk as the seller of the scalp. In addition, a hair morphological report was prepared for the scalp by the Saxony State Office of Criminal Investigation to prove its human origin. The result of this examination, in which the object was not damaged, but only the hair structure was closely examined under the microscope, showed that it was with very high probability human hair, which is at least 150 years old and probably comes from the North American region. Regarding further research, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe and the foundation commissioned two outside experts in the field of Ojibwe and Sioux material culture to evaluate the scalp in their style. Likewise, the tribe submitted findings on the Swift Hawk person. Thus, there was a person of that name at the Buffalo Bill Wild West Show who died in France in 1890. However, at the same time, the tribe found that Swift Hawk was a common traditional Lakota family name that remained in use until. Thus, it is ultimately difficult to clarify which Swift Hawk is meant in Patty Frank's story. Also, regarding the veracity of Patty Frank's narrative, all that could be found was that there was no evidence of Patty Frank being in North America in 1904. There is only documentation that he was employed with a group of artists on a US tour of the Barnum and Bailey Circus in 1910. It's more likely that the scalp, like many other objects in the Patty Frank collection, was acquired through one of Patty Frank's many dealer contacts. As a result of the research, both parties, foundation and tribe, determined that exact tribal attribution of the scalp could not be clearly established. However, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe continued to desire to bring the scalp as a Native American ancestor back home for burial. And this was also advocated in a resolution at the National Congress of American Indians in 2015. However, a final decision was delayed for another 3 years. In the meantime, there have been several personnel changes in the museum staff and also in the Karl May Foundation. In the last 4 years alone, we have had 3 different directors. In addition, I came back to my remarks from the first part of my presentation. The museum and the foundation were led for many years by Karl May fans and not by scientifically trained professionals. Many of these Karl May fans sit today in the foundation in the so-called Board of Trustees. It is principally a kind of a council of elders, which watches over the company and the museum and is responsible for preserving the legacy of Karl May and his wife, and so also for the collection of the museum. Ultimately, many of these people come from a different time, and it takes time before views and ways of thinking change. Nevertheless, at least in 2015, the Karl May Foundation was persuaded to draw up its own guidelines for dealing with human remains in its collection. This made us one of the first museum institutions in Germany to issue concrete guidelines on the subject. The guidelines were also a direct result of the reclaiming of the scalp. But the museum management alone, so also me, cannot decide in the Kalmai Museum about the release or even repatriation of objects from the collection. We can make recommendations to the Board of Trustees, but the decision lies there. It has taken the last few years to convince this body to return the scalp. However, we as the museum's management have been looking for more and more ways in recent years to establish contact with indigenous representatives, groups, and artists, to develop projects with them to present contemporary indigenous culture here in the region. For example, we had a workshop with Tsimshian artist Edward Earl Bryant, who carved a totem pole for the museum in honor of Kalmai in 2017. We invited Native American musicians for concerts and held exhibitions of contemporary indigenous arts, to which we were able to invite also indigenous artists like Andy Everson or Nicholas Glennon. You can see some of our projects the last years. And I think these are the paths we want to continue to take in the future, using the Kalmai Museum here as a platform for indigenous representatives and artists to show that indigenous life and culture is not past, but alive. In 2018, the Kalmai Museum got a new museum director. For the first time, someone with a professional museum background. He made contact with the US State Department and asked them to mediate the scalp case. So the talks between us and the tribe start again. The US State Department representative worked out a proposed solution. Both parties committed to follow this proposal, and the mediator's proposal was sent out in May 2020. The mediator suggested that the Schultz and Mary tribes' request for respectful burial of the ancestral remain be granted and to give the scalp in return for that. However, the proposal of the mediator came at a time when not only everything was disrupted by the corona pandemic and the museum was closed for several months, but also our director, who had come in 2018, had resigned at this moment. We were left without leadership and direction during this time and the following weeks, as the board of the Kalmai Foundation had also dissolved. It took until the fall of 2020 before the structures were restored in our foundation. After that, we could finally deal with the proposal of the mediator. In the end, the newly elected board of the foundation voted united in favor of the mediator's proposal and the transfer of the scalp for dignified burial. However, the Board of Trustees also had to give its approval. And this was where the big problem lay. It took many discussions before, after long meetings, the Board of Trustees in our foundation agreed to allow the transfer of the scalp. After the decision to hand over the scalp, another problem was to when the scalp could be officially handed over and how the scalp as a human remain could be taken out of the country according to the German regulations of burial law. The transfer of the scalp could ultimately only be carried out with the support of the US Embassy, the US Consulate General in Leipzig, and the Foreign Office of the Federal Republic of Germany. For this purpose, the Kalmai Foundation had to decide to officially hand over the scalp to the representative of the US Department of State, represented by the cultural attaché of the US Embassy in Berlin, David Mies. The US Embassy then ensured that the scalp could be transferred to the US through diplomatic channels. The United States government, represented by the US Department of State, also agreed to receive the items as bailee on behalf of the Schultz and Mary tribes of Chippewa Indians. The corona pandemic then prevented several attempts for the official handover. Also, it was not possible to invite representatives of the tribe. So the handover finally took place this year on April the 12th. And so this is the photo of the signing of the transfer on this day. For this, I would like to thank now again all participants and supporters. Nevertheless, I have to conclude by saying that it was a very tough and emotional battle for us eternally, and especially for me. I honestly do not know if and how, and especially when, further returns of human remains can take place in the Karl Foundation. On the one hand, basic information about the origin of all other human remains is missing so far. Here, research must first be carried out and the origin must be clarified. On the other side, our board of trustees has to decide. In the meantime, however, I am not only the scientific director at the Karl Museum, but also at the same time the only person working on content in the Karl Museum. I'm at the same time in charge of the Indian collection and the Karl collections. I work alone for exhibitions, projects, and events, and I'm jointly responsible for the staff and the entire management. The background is the Karl Museum is one of the few privately run museums in Germany, so we have no financial means in the near future for more staff and for research. Maybe you think that these are excuses, but it is not easy for one person alone to fight against opinions of its own bosses and at the same time take into account the demands of the indigenous representations and representatives. Also, like Martin said, it is also a language problem. Very few of the people in the Karl Foundation in Waterboil understand English or cannot speak it. In the future, I would like to build a young museums team and establish contacts with indigenous representatives to build relationships that will make the museum more of a place for cultural encounters and exchange in the future. And I look forward to meeting with indigenous representatives here in Radebeul in the future and also having the opportunity to work with them on various projects. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thanks a lot, Robin. As we can see from the comments, there's a lot that needs to be talked about now. And I think, I don't know if there are already questions, but maybe I leave it to Shannon and to Colleen. Is that okay?
Oh, that's fine, Martin. Thank you. I'm going to address what I guess some would call the elephant in the room. We appreciate, Robin, that you're here with us today. To be clear, some of the things you showed in your presentation were offensive and harmful. We also have an expectation that all presenters that are here are working to help be good ambassadors to their bosses and directors. And it's really helpful to better understand why an institution makes some of the decisions that it makes. And I know one question I have about the repatriation back to Sault Ste. Marie through the State Department is, it's my understanding that the institution did not want to work directly with the tribe and would not work directly with the tribe, which seems counterintuitive to the amazing collaborations that so many institutions have had with tribal nations to better educate the institutions so they can fulfill the missions of their museum. So why was it that Karl May Museum did not want to work with Sault Ste. Marie and instead chose to work through the State Department, Robin?
Yeah, in part, yes, but there were actually legal issues as well, and the board of trustees was only unsure. And the second thing was I said yet now again is the language barrier, and it is so difficult for I have to say it now, for old guys to understand English and to think in another language, and there are so many unsure things and also uncertainties in there.
Right. And what we found is even with the greatest, longest bridges to cross, willing parties can still make it through and meet in the middle. And the association and our tribal partners have been involved in many repatriations, both domestically and internationally, and have found that the greatest opportunities have come when the parties are willing. And the story that you've told really shows that Karl May is not a willing participant. These issues seem to be able to be resolved and have been resolved positively with other institutions. There's also an issue with, we understand you have other ancestral human remains in your collections. What is the institution doing now to help support repatriation of those ancestors?
Yeah, this is a good question. But I have to say our institution, our institution has decided that this is the only return of a human remain at the moment. This is not my opinion, this is the decision.
So as an ambassador, Robin, and you can please take down your presentation there so we can have a little bit bigger heads in our Brady Bunch boxes here. Then what is your recommendation to us on how we persuade or move your bosses to a different place?
I think the pressure the board of trustees in our foundation have failed to return the scalp, however, has unfortunately led them to block themselves at the moment, and all the more for future returns and the talks. I can understand the anger and the rage of the indigenous people and nations, but never leads to the achievement of a common goal. I therefore advocate that we all meet at eye level and first listen to and respect the attitude of the other person, and we should at first to knowledge each other, and the backgrounds and the and the consider of the other side.
So that's great. Will you please pass on to the board that the Association on American Indian Affairs would like to host a meeting, a virtual meeting where we can bring together tribal nations who are affiliated with some of the collections at the Karl May Museum and meet as best we can face-to-face over the virtual technology that we have, so that we can talk about these issues and learn how best to consider one another's positions.
I've thank you for this, and I think also, and this is one what I have to say now, as you say it, as an ambassador. So I will go now to my bosses at the Stiftung and at the foundation, and will talk again with them. And
we would love to bring people together. That's
And as long as I work in the museum, I will speak for this for these things.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to shut up now. I know Chell is in the raised hands, and I'm going to bring her up. She has a question. Chell, you're up. Are you still there?
Yes, thank you. Hi. So I wanted to also emphasize what Shannon was saying. I really appreciated her words very much. And I think there was a visceral reaction because when we were seeing ancestral remains or even renderings, I was getting messages left and right privately about how that impacted. And I would just ask you, when you are dealing with objects that have cultural significance, or we're dealing with Indigenous remains, or with human remains in general, I would just ask you if you could just try to place someone in your family in the position of that scalp, and try to imagine how it would feel to have that image put before you, and do that before you do any of your presentations, and just kind of go through it and go, how might that make me feel if I was in that position? I think it might help you. I also got feedback from some of our team members for the work that we do. And I wanted to convey to you that, some people have been mentioned that with your collaborations, they didn't know that you were presenting today. And so they asked me to convey to you, when you are presenting on a cultural group, if you could just give them a heads up that this is happening, so that they can actually at least be able to watch what's being said about their cultural community, that would mean a lot to them. And again, thank you for you guys. Like Shannon said, we are learning. Everybody needs to learn, and this is how we do that. And so I'm coming at you with connection and nothing other than that. So, Lado.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question for Martin. I'm going to show on stage. Paiute baskets are being held at Göteborg's. I'm not going to pretend to pronounce.
Ethnographic.
Thank you. Museum in Stockholm. Is there any updated contact for them?
Let's see.
I think Martin's looking.
What I'm doing is I put the link to the online database in the chat for the National Museums of World Culture. That's 4 museums. One is the Ethnographic Museum in Gothenburg. The other one is the Ethnographic Museum in Stockholm. You can search either through just one of these databases or through all of them together. When I stopped working in Sweden at the National Museums of World Culture, the museums decided not to replace me. So there is currently no one responsible for these collections. But there is, of course, well, it's a bit more complicated. There is a deputy head of collection that has been my boss. There was a head of collection that left shortly after me and has also not been replaced. The easiest way, if you want to get in touch with the museum, is go through the database. You have a comment field for every entry in the database. Go to the comments and send a message and let them know you want to be contacted and have questions. You don't need to be specific, just let them know you have questions concerning this entry. The head of collections, well, the substitute head of collections at the moment is probably the person that will get that information. There is someone responsible for the database, and he will make sure to forward your questions, comments, whatever it is, to the person that is currently responsible at the museums in Sweden. But there is no one to contact directly. And after I left, they also changed the web page. It's a new web page, and you don't find any contact information anymore. So I don't even really know who's still working there. And Sweden is still going through a lot of changes. So the easiest way is go through the database. There is a repatriation council at that museum, at the National Museums. So if you want to ask for repatriation, well, maybe mention that in that field. and then the Repatriation Council can contact you directly. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Martin. That was helpful. I'm wondering, Martin, if you or any of your cohorts, I know you all gave some very specific information about particular histories with your collection, but do any of you have any kind of broader histories or understanding of how and why so many North American and Native American collections wound up in Europe, and where we can learn more about those histories and stories?
Well, maybe I start on just mention that the Restoring Ancestral Connections webpage that you just mentioned is a good source to find out more about the histories of these collections. There are smaller collections already from the 17th century from North America that you find in several European countries, just because many European countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, even Sweden, had smaller colonies in the eastern parts of the what is now the United States, and that's when colonization started. So these collections are still there, and then you have traders, travelers, all kinds of different people from all over the world that amassed collections. You have, or had, I don't know if that still exists, but the National Museum of Brazil in Rio de Janeiro had a very impressive collection from North America. So you'll find them not only in Europe, but all over the world, and that is because of these colonial connections.
Yes, thank you. Again, I invite anyone who has a question or wants to have a discussion on these topics, invite you to join us here. Martin, do you have any maybe some simple how-tos that you could share with us in 3 or 5 minutes about how to start our journey on looking into moving towards repatriation from a particular institution in Europe?
That's very tricky.
Well, right, because it's so diverse, and what the institutions have available to look at is so diverse. So what's the first thing we should look for?
First thing is, if you're looking for ancestors, don't reduce your search to what we would call ethnographic museums. So all of us here in this panel, we represent ethnographic museums, but there is, as mentioned by Monica and Ilja, there is so much more. You have anthropological museums, you have all kinds of different institutions. Over time, provenance research is something that started several years ago, so many of us have quite a good overview over collections also in other institutions, and it's always one option for you to contact one of us if you have certain questions concerning material in certain museums. There is a language barrier we talked about before. If you contact museums in Portugal or in Spain, that might be a bit tricky. They are not necessarily working in the same direction as us. Doesn't mean they are not repatriating, they do, but there are different language and cultural barriers, but we all try to do our best to do what is necessary to be done. So for you, if you go to the bigger museums, like in France, the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle, these institutions usually have databases available online. See if there is something for North America at all. And if you find something, contact them and ask them specifically for the questions that you want to ask. For Sweden, the National Museums of World Culture you have the link to the database. What I did while I was working there is there was one term that was used for ancestors. That is the common term human remain that is widely used. We had to use that. There was no choice to be more respectful in terminology. But that's a term you can search for in the database. And you will find everything that I was able to identify. These entries do not or should not have pictures. As I said before, I wasn't able to change everything, but what I tried, well, at least to make sure is that if there are pictures, they are blocked. But you will find information on the origin, and also the inventory books have been scanned. So you find the inventory book attached to that entry. You find not that much information, but well, if there's anything, since that's in Swedish, if there's anything that I can help with, I'm happy to do so. Just contact me. There are different levels of information that you find in all these different databases that you find throughout Europe. The easiest way is, maybe I don't want to burden that on you, Shannon, but the easiest way might be to contact Shannon or Colleen, and they can forward questions to us.
Yes, we're happy to do that. I want to, because we're getting close to the end of our time together, I want to, of course, invite all of those watching there to reach out to the individual speakers through the direct messaging here in our system and through the emails that they've shared. You can also reach out to the association and we can put you in touch with folks. But I want to ask our speakers if they have any final words or information that they'd like to share with us as we depart from this session.
Yeah, maybe adding to your question, Shannon, to Martin, whom to contact. In Germany, we have, it's called the German Lost Art Foundation. It's a peculiar name, but they also have a center now. They were first more for responsible for restitution of art due to the World War II and National Socialism, but they have now a new center that is also concentrated on ethnographic collections. So they might be a good starting point also if, when it comes to Germany, I can share the link to the website, but of course, oh no, I'm sorry, that was the wrong, oh no, it's right. But of course, you can always contact Ilja and me, because also in our foundation, it's not only our collection in the Ethnological Museum, but we also have within the national museums, the Museum of Prehistoric Cultures. And they have archaeological collection, but also a lot of human remains, I have to say.
Mona, would you like to say anything to conclude?
Yeah, I can say that it's of course always possible to contact each museum, which is difficult. And I had a good experience with the General Consulate here in Frankfurt. The consul himself and the people in the offices for cultural affairs, they are very sensitive to these questions, and it would be an idea to do it over the to do requests with the help of the American consulates or the embassy and so on. I think to really gather all these museums in Germany, it's a full life work, yeah. And so we need to help people who would distribute lists and who would really go into the affair and put some pressure also on on the representatives in the ministries and so on to make the European problem visible also in the United States and ask for help. It's I think there is a lot of interest, but the problem is how to gather people and how to gather information. So I think every single museum is willing to cooperate a lot, and but people don't find us. That's the point.
Thank you, Mona. Karen, would you like to say something in closing? Oh, we can't hear you, Karen, but I don't see that you're muted. No, can't hear you. Sorry about that. Are you able to change your mic over? All right. Well, while we wait to see if Karen can get back. Oh, can we hear you? No, can't hear you. You might need to refresh yourself. Sorry about that, Karen. Well, I want to thank everyone, and maybe while I'm doing this, Karen will pop back in and can close. But I want to thank everyone for your patience. This has been a long session. It's been a difficult session, and we know that. We know it's going to be difficult, and that every different institutions are going to have different capacities, and that our relationships take time to build. And that, okay, we can hear you, Karen. Go ahead, Karen, if you had anything that you wanted to close with, and we'll close with you. Uh-oh. All right. So I don't think Karen can hear us now.
Can I just say?
Okay. Go ahead, Martin.
Just to explain something, because I got a private message asking me to explain why I have a polar bear skin right behind me. It's not a hunting trophy, and I'm very sorry if this offended anybody, but we are a museum focusing on contemporary circumpolar art, and the artists are also hunters or reindeer herders, but they are not, even if they are full-time artists, they are also full-time hunters. So this polar bear skin is from one of these hunters and artists, and he gave that to us. It's from Subsistence Hunt, and he wanted us to make sure that we can show, not tell their story, but show their story. And hunting is part of that. So he gave us this to be shown like we do here at the moment. Just wanted to clarify that. So thank you.
Well, and that's a beautiful story to end our session with today, because that's exactly the type of relationship that Native nations and Indigenous communities can have with institutions to help better educate the public and fulfill the institution's mission to educate the public. So thanks, everyone.
Everything back.